Okay, let's talk about some external factors that control plant growth. We're going to talk about tropisms in lab, but basically what a tropism is the bending of any plant part in response to stimuli. And if it's bending towards the stimuli, it's a positive response. And if it's bending away, it's a negative response. Circadian rhythms I gave to you in a handout that you guys can read. The circadian rhythm is kind of like an internal clock. So, for example, if you took plants into space, they would still open their stomata during what would have been the day for them normally and close them at night. Photoperiodism is the effect of day length on flowering. So we have short day plants and long day plants, and we have day neutral plants. So let's just talk about photoperiodism and how it works. One thing is that the main thing is that the plants have photoreceptors that have pigments in them, and they are labeled here PR and PFR. Okay, so really the pigment that's in the plant is PR, and during the daylight when there's plenty of red light available, what will happen is PR will be converted to PFR. And PFR makes a biological response, or that is, as it builds up, it's either going to make the plants long day plants or short day plants, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then at nighttime, when the far red shows up and or it's dark, the PFR is converted back to PR. So this pigment gets converted during the day to PFR, and then during the night back to PR. All right, and this is the far red also, by the way, has to do with seasons, right? So that during the summer you have more red light or longer period of red light, and during the winter you have a longer period of far red light comparatively. Okay, so let's look at how this works. Okay, so if you have this is an example of short day plants. So here is the amount. The red is the amount of PFR building up, and if you have daylight for 8 hours a day, the PFR will build up about this amount, and then it'll start degrading here. Okay, now in short day plants, and also this is like during the summer, so you have the PFR building up and staying up for a longer period of time, and then when it's dark it'll degrade. Okay, so in this case there's like a critical period, in this plant is 14 and a half hours, and if the PFR is higher than or high during the critical period, then no flowering will occur. If it's low during the critical period, then it can flower. So these are short day plants. These would either be blooming in the fall or sometimes even in the winter, depending on where they're located. So long day plants are the opposite. So it's the same graph here, except for, let me move this down a little bit. Okay, it's the same graph here, except for during the critical period, if you don't have PFR, then no flowering, and during the critical period, if you have high PFR, then flowering. So there's differences then in short and long day plants. You could sum up by saying the short day plants have to have PFR less than the amount for the critical period, or less than high in the critical period, or less amount, and the long day plants need it high during the critical period. Okay, so then some other things that we want to talk about are dormancy. Dormancy is just like an arrest of growth or activity, and it's usually in response to temperature and water. And you can have dormancy of the whole plant, but mainly that is in the buds and or the seeds. So let's just talk about the buds. If you have dormancy of the buds, usually this is a temperature or day length effect, and sometimes buds will show what we call acclimation, which is a cold hardiness. They either move solutes into the buds so that they don't freeze as easily, or they might move water out of the bud and sort of have a dry scale over the meristem that is somewhat hard and has a lot of cuticle type stuff called suberin, and that will keep it water protected as well. Now, some plants also move solutes from the vacuole into the cytoplasm, sort of like an antifreeze, or change their cell membranes by moving more steroids into their cell membranes, and that makes them more pliable or keeps them pliable and from being crisp, so to speak, during the cold periods. Now, seeds, they also have a dormancy, and most seeds have a seed coat on the outside of them. And if you have a seed coat and you need some dormancy, you can have a couple of different things. In other words, you either usually it's temperature or light or water that is going to make the seeds start to germinate. Now, some seeds need stratification. So what stratification is they need a period of cold before they can sprout. Other seeds might need something called scarification, which is just a roughing up of the seed coat. This usually would happen by stomach acids in an animal that would eat it and then poop it out somewhere else. And it would have that HCl or hydrochloric acid that's in the stomach sort of eating away at that seed coat. It could also be a lot of wetland plants that are near streams. They would need to be roughed up by the rocks that they would be traveling over, or roughed up by animals' activity around them. Vernalization is, in some plants, if you keep the seeds at 1 degree C for a short period of time, then they will bloom that spring. So some plants wouldn't bloom if the temperature was higher than that. So if you wanted to make them bloom, you could put them, like, for example, in the refrigerator or something. All right, so to break dormancy, you either have to have, like I was saying, a cold period, or you have to have a dry period right before. And then, it might be a photoperiod response, that is day length response in like to seasons. And if you've had those periods and then you get water, light, and soil, of course, then the dormancy can be broken from either actually the buds or the seeds. All right. So then flowering, let's just talk about that briefly. We'll talk a little more about flowering in a bit. Flowering is basically, a flower is a modified branch, is coming out of the leaf axils, and whether it turns into a new leaf, a branch, or a flower is hormonally controlled, and of course the hormones that are present and when they are present is genetically controlled. So this all has to do with genetics. We'll talk a little bit more about this later when we talk about genetics. And then the last thing that I want to say in response to external factors is something called nastic movement. Now, this is a movement, it's like a tropism, it's a response to a stimuli, but it's not necessarily it's not in the direction. So in other words, whatever the stimuli is, let's say it's sunlight or lack of sunlight, it's not moving towards the sunlight or away from sunlight, it's instead just moving in response to the fact that it either has sun or doesn't. So an example is there's something called nutation of seedlings, and what they do is they kind of rotate, and basically they're looking for the light. So they're like rotating around at nighttime, so that's a nastic movement. And then when the light comes in, they're going to move in the direction of the light, and that would be a positive phototropism. So that's just one example.